There are things a person can explain away in the daylight. Caroline had tried, but then she'd gone back into that forest, and he'd been there like he knew she would come. 9 words. Something I haven't done in a very long time, and something I can't entirely take back. She still didn't know what he meant, but she was starting to understand that finding out would cost her something. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're listening from. Part 2 starts right now. He didn't answer right away. That was the first thing she noticed. Not evasion, exactly, but the particular stillness of a man choosing his words the way someone else might choose whether to open a door they can't close again. The forest around them had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, and Caroline stood in it with her hands in her coat pockets and her green eyes on his face, and waited, because she had learned in the past 48 hours that pushing Aleksander Volkov produced nothing useful. He would arrive at his own pace or not at all. "Walk with me," he said finally. It wasn't a question. She fell into step beside him anyway because the alternative was standing alone in the dark, and because, if she was being precise about it, she wanted to. The ground was frozen and uneven beneath her boots, and the trees here were older than anything she had grown up around, their trunks wide enough that 2 people couldn't link hands around them. Aleksander moved through the forest like someone who had memorized it in a different season, his stride unhurried and certain, and she found herself watching him from the corner of her eye with the specific attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand. He was wearing a dark coat, simply cut, and the cold didn't seem to register on him the way it registered on her. His dark brown hair was slightly unsettled by the wind. In the low light filtering through the branches, his amber eyes were difficult to read, not blank, but layered, like looking at something through water. "There are things that exist," he said without preamble, "that medicine doesn't have categories for, things that predate the frameworks people use to explain the world." Caroline kept her pace steady. "That's a very careful way of saying something. It's a careful thing to say. Are you going to tell me what you actually did, or are we going to talk around it until I freeze to death, which would be somewhat ironic given the circumstances?" Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, brief and unguarded in a way that felt like an accident. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it, and it did something unexpected to the careful distance she had been maintaining since she walked into this forest. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were in a small clearing she hadn't seen before, open to the sky, where the moonlight came through clean and even and made everything look like it had been lit deliberately. He turned to face her, and for a moment he simply looked at her, not the measured, calculating look she had become familiar with, but something more direct, more exposed. "My blood has properties that human medicine can't account for," he said. "When I brought you inside that first night, you were already failing. I made a decision without asking your permission, and I'm aware of what that means." Caroline held his gaze. Her heart was doing something unsteady behind her ribs that she chose not to examine too closely. "What does it mean?" He looked at her for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was quieter than she had heard it yet. "It means that, whatever happens next, I'm responsible for you, whether I want to be or not." The wind moved through the clearing. She noticed distantly that he didn't look like a man who resented that responsibility. He looked like a man who was afraid of it. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because she was afraid. That would have been simpler, more navigable. But because she wasn't, and that fact required considerably more processing than fear would have. She lay in her grandmother's bed, listening to the radiator and turning the conversation over in her mind with the methodical attention she usually gave to books that refused to resolve cleanly. His blood had properties that medicine couldn't account for. He was responsible for her now, whether he wanted to be or not. He hadn't looked like a man who resented it. She had gone back inside after the clearing, walked through her own house like it belonged to someone slightly different than she was, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without turning on a light. She was a woman who taught 12-year-olds about narrative structure. She knew what it meant when a story introduced something it intended to return to. She showed up at his door the next morning. She told herself it was practical. There were things she needed to understand, medical implications, a conversation that deserved daylight and walls around it rather than frozen ground and moonlight. That was mostly true. He opened the door before she knocked, which she decided not to comment on. He was dressed simply, dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and looked like he had been awake for some time, which raised questions she filed away for later. He stepped back and let her in without a word, and she followed him through the entry hall and into a room she hadn't seen the night she woke here. It was a library, floor to ceiling, every wall, dark wood shelves built so precisely into the stone that they looked original to the house. The books themselves were dense and varied. She caught Latin spines, Cyrillic, French, English titles ranging from 17th century philosophy to contemporary physics, and the room smelled like old paper and wood smoke, and something else underneath that she was beginning to recognize as simply him. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at it with an expression she couldn't fully control. "You read," she said. It came out slightly stupidly, she was aware. "Extensively," he said, and there was that, almost amusement again, more deliberate this time, like he had decided to let her see it. He gestured to one of two chairs positioned near the fireplace, and she sat, and he sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was a different kind of silence than the forest, less charged, more considered, domestic almost in a way that felt dangerously easy. "Ask what you came to ask," he said. So she did. She asked about his blood, what it was, what it had done to her, whether the effects were permanent. He answered carefully, factually, watching her face as he spoke the way a person does when they're gauging how much the truth is going to cost. What she learned was this: the healing was real, and it would hold. The connection it created between them was also real, a biological and something more than biological tether that meant, in practical terms, that her system would now register his proximity and his absence in ways she wasn't going to be able to rationalize. "So my body knows where you are," she said slowly. "More or less. That's..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Inconvenient." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "it is." But something in the way he said it suggested that inconvenient was not the word he would have chosen for himself. She came back the following afternoon. She told herself it was because she had more questions, which was true. She did not examine too closely the fact that she had also changed her shirt twice before leaving the house. The library had become, without any formal negotiation, the place where they existed together most naturally. He was already there when she arrived. He always was, she was beginning to notice, as if he arranged his day around her visits without acknowledging that was what he was doing. There was coffee on the low table between the chairs. He had started making it without asking, which was such a specific and domestic thing that she had stopped remarking on it. They had developed, over the past several days, a rhythm that had no name and no precedent in her experience. She would arrive. They would talk about her students, about books they had both read, about the particular quality of November light in western Massachusetts, about everything except the things that lived just underneath the surface of every conversation. She was learning him in fragments. He had a precise, dry humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. He had opinions about literature that were sharp enough to be argued with, which she did, and he seemed to find this genuinely pleasing in a way he was careful not to show too plainly. He did not talk about himself in any linear way, no childhood mentioned, no family, no history offered voluntarily, but she was assembling something from the edges. The books. The way he moved through the house like every room was equally familiar. The occasional pause before he answered a question about time, as if he were doing a calculation she wasn't meant to see. That afternoon, she was on the floor. She had pulled 3 books from a lower shelf and was cross-legged in front of the fire with them spread open around her, following a thread of something that had caught her attention, and she had simply stayed there because the carpet was thick and the fire was warm, and she had, somewhere in the past week, stopped performing casualness around him and started actually feeling it. He was in the chair above and to her left, reading. At some point, she looked up to ask him something about a passage, and found him already looking at her, not with the measuring quality she had grown accustomed to, but with something quieter and more unguarded than that. He looked away first. Her question dissolved before she asked it. She turned back to her book and read the same sentence 4 times without retaining a word of it. Later, when the fire had burned lower and the room had settled into the kind of warmth that makes movement feel unnecessary, he reached down without comment and closed the book she had stopped reading, his fingers briefly passing over her hand where it rested on the cover. It lasted less than 2 seconds. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. But when she finally stood to leave and he walked her to the door, standing close in the narrow entry hall while she pulled on her coat, she was acutely, almost painfully aware of how little space existed between them, and of the fact that neither of them moved to increase it. It snowed that night. Caroline woke to the particular silence that only happens when the world outside has been muffled overnight, and she lay still for a moment before checking her phone and finding a message from the school district announcing a delayed opening. She had 2 extra hours and nowhere to be, and she spent approximately 4 minutes pretending she wasn't going to use them to walk through the forest. The path between her property and his had become familiar enough that she could follow it without thinking, which was itself something she tried not to think about too much. The snow had settled evenly over everything, and the forest in the early morning light was very still and very white and almost unbearably quiet. The kind of scene that makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very present. He opened the door before she reached it. He was holding 2 mugs, which meant he had heard her coming, or known she was coming in some other way that she had filed under things to address later. He handed her one without comment. The coffee was exactly how she took it, which he had figured out without asking, and she wrapped both hands around the mug and followed him inside. They ended up in a room she hadn't spent much time in, a sitting room at the back of the house with tall windows that looked out over a garden she hadn't known existed, the hedges and stone paths now softened under snow into something almost formal in their geometry. She stood at the window for a while just looking at it, and he stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold radiating off the glass. "You designed this," she said. It wasn't a question. There was something in the garden's structure, precise, patient, built to last, that felt consistent with everything she was learning about him. "A long time ago," he said. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the distance between them was significantly smaller than it had been a moment ago without either of them having visibly moved. She noticed, not for the first time, the particular quality of his amber eyes up close, warm and still and very focused, in a face that gave very little else away. Her heart did something it had been doing with increasing frequency around him, which she had run out of ways to attribute to anything other than the obvious. "Alexander," she said quietly, "what are we doing?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might redirect, deflect, return to the careful distance he maintained so deliberately. Instead, he reached up and tucked a strand of her dark brown hair behind her ear. Slowly, with the specific intentionality of someone who has been not doing something for a very long time and has finally decided to stop. His fingers rested briefly against her jaw afterward. Barely there, warm. "Something I keep telling myself I shouldn't," he said. And then he kissed her. It was not urgent or overwhelming. It was quiet and deliberate and entirely certain, the way everything he did was certain, and it lasted long enough that when it ended, she had to remind herself how to stand evenly on both feet. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and what she saw in his face was not triumph or relief. It was something much closer to fear. She didn't ask him to explain the fear. She understood it in the way you understand something that lives in the body rather than the mind. Not as a conclusion you reach, but as a weight you simply begin to carry. He stepped back, not far, not coldly, but with the deliberateness of a man who trusts himself more at a certain distance. She let him. She turned back to the window and looked at the snow-covered garden and gave them both a moment to breathe, which felt like the most generous thing she could offer. "How old are you?" she said finally, not accusatory, just honest. He was quiet long enough that the answer shaped itself before he gave it. "Older than this house," he said. "Older than most things you'd use as a reference point." She nodded slowly. She had known something like this was coming, had been assembling it from fragments for days, the pauses before answers about time, the library that spanned centuries, the way he moved through the world as if he had long ago stopped being surprised by it. Knowing it intellectually and standing in it were two different experiences. "Does it change things?" he asked. There was something careful in the question, something that had been waiting. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that focused amber gaze, and she could see the tension in him, the jaw set just slightly, the stillness that wasn't calm but control. He had kissed her, and then waited for her to leave. She was still here. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm still standing here, so." Something in him settled, not visibly, but she felt it, the way you feel a room change temperature. He crossed to where she stood and stopped close to her, not touching, just near, and looked at her the way he had in the clearing that first night, directly, with something uncalculated in it. "I have not let anyone this close," he said quietly, "in a very long time. I want to be honest with you about what that means. It means I don't entirely trust my own judgment right now, and I'm aware that's not a comfortable thing to say to someone you've just kissed." "It's the most honest thing you've said to me," she told him, which is saying something, because you're surprisingly honest for someone who withholds this much. That earned her something she hadn't seen from him before, a real smile, brief and unguarded, that rearranged his face entirely and made him look for just a moment like someone much less burdened. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his sternum, not as a gesture of romance, but of contact, solid and real and deliberate. His hand came up and covered hers, and they stood like that in front of the snow-covered window for a long moment, not kissing, not speaking, just present with each other in a way that felt more significant than either. Then his expression shifted, subtly, but she caught it. Something moving behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. His hand tightened briefly over hers. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, "about why I was in that forest the night you collapsed." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." He had been watching her property for 3 nights before she walked into the forest, not out of surveillance, out of something older and less rational than that, a pull he hadn't felt in long enough that he had nearly convinced himself he no longer could. He told her this slowly, standing at the window with the snow outside going blue in the fading afternoon light, and she listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with those green eyes on his face and her hand still warm where it had rested against his chest. He told her about the woman he had loved 3 centuries ago, about losing her, about the specific quality of that grief, which had not diminished so much as calcified into something he had built his entire existence around, and about the night Caroline had collapsed at his feet, the recognition that had moved through him like a current, not of her face or her name, but of something structural, something in the architecture of who she was. "I'm not telling you this because I think you're her," he said carefully. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand that what I feel for you is not confusion. It's not projection. You are entirely yourself. And that is—" He paused, and something crossed his face that she had no word for yet. "That is considerably more than I was prepared for." Caroline looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room, took his face in both hands, and kissed him with the full weight of everything she had been carrying for the past 3 weeks. The diagnosis, the forest, the mornings in the library, the slow and irreversible process of falling for someone who made every prior version of her life feel like a rough draft. He kissed her back with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been waiting a very long time to stop being careful. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, and the room was very quiet, and outside the snow kept falling over the garden he had built centuries ago and was only now, perhaps, beginning to understand the purpose of. "I don't know what I am to you yet," she said softly, "or what any of this looks like going forward." "Neither do I," he said, "but I'd like to find out." She laughed, a real one, slightly undone at the edges, and he pulled her close, and she let him, and that was enough. It was, she thought, considerably more than enough. She had been given 4 days. She intended to use every single one that came after. If this story moved you even a little, drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments. We genuinely read every single one. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way to the end, and for making these stories worth telling. We'll see you in the next one.